The senator from Richland.
Mr. President, 5:30 Wednesday afternoon, 23 and a half hours before this ends.
Senator from Maury, Senator Rankin, what purpose do you rise, sir?
See if the senator yield for a question.
Will the senator yield for a question?
Just
Sure.
Senator from Maury, Senator Rankin, what purpose do you rise, sir?
See if the senator yield for a question.
Will the senator yield for a question?
Just
Sure.
Senator
Refuses.
Harpootlian.
Does the senator,
I hereby yield.
yeah, okay. The senator yields for a question.
Did you watch Dragnet as a child? Because I swear to the Lord, you are channeling Dragnet right now.
I, in fact, did watch Dragnet, and I wasn't a child. I'm trying to grow up. I'm conflicted here because I have some very serious things to talk about, but at the same time, this has been a process. This has been a process. I was just talking to my friend of half a century, chairman of Senate Finance, about this process, and he's done this for 43 years. My utmost respect goes out. I mean, I loved him 50 years ago. I must say I have more respect for him today than I've ever had, not only for what he's accomplished, but what he's had to go through. And I've been here but 6 years, and I must tell you, Senator from Gaffney, this is an extraordinary process for which I really don't have an explanation. I mean, I've been a part of it now. I've watched it from afar, and now I've been a part of it. And here we are, as I say, 23 and a half hours before adjournment, and we're dealing with what I think, in some ways, is extraordinarily important. From a legislative standpoint, I'm not sure it's going to change many lives or change many opinions. But I think it's an appropriate time for me to talk about some things that give me grave concern, because a lot of this, the CRT bill talks about facts, and a lot of the CRT bill talks about what can be taught and what can't be taught. We recently had a president whose chief advisor, when confronted with facts, talked about alternative facts. So my facts may not be your facts, in effect. And I tell you why that's really, really important. And we talked just a moment ago, joking about a TV show from the 50s and 60s, which in fact I did watch. But when I think back on the 50s and 60s and the history, my history of growing up in Charlotte, North Carolina, the facts I know are not necessarily the facts you know. I was talking last week to the senator from Greenville, who is about my age, a little younger, older, I'm not sure which, and we shared a common experience called segregation. I didn't share it with Senator Scott or the senator from Colleton because I didn't share anything with them. I didn't share my restaurants. I didn't share my schools. I didn't share my restrooms. I didn't share anything with them. My world was all white and not necessarily all cruel. Senator Loftus and I were talking about how communities reached out and helped all folks, poor whites, poor blacks, in times of need. That wasn't necessarily the rule, though, because when we got done helping our African American brothers and sisters, we went back to our all-white school, our all-white neighborhood, our all-white hospital, our all-white whatever. I never went to school with an African American. I never had any African American friends until I got to college. And so when we talk about critical race theory, and we talk about how we depict for our young people this very complicated and yet at the same time very simplistic piece of our history, you can't do it without pointing fingers. Now, when I say pointing fingers, should I be responsible for what somebody did? Should I be held accountable for what somebody did in 1850 or 1900? I mean, one of the most intolerant racial diatribes I've ever read came from that guy right there, John C. Calhoun. Now, he cloaked all of this in the sense of states' rights, federalism, but he believed slavery was an institution to which we, I had the extraordinary luck of the lottery to be born in this country white. But I appreciate those folks that didn't win. And do I hold John C. Calhoun responsible for what we are experiencing today? No. We are at the Clemson campus. The Calhoun Mansion was there. I visited it. I read about him. I understood what he meant, what he talked about. I understood the context of that. Do I hold Thomas and Jefferson responsible for slavery, or George Washington, or Woodrow Wilson? I mean, they were products of their times. The question we're here today to talk about is how we depict that to the young people of our state, and also the hate crimes legislation is how we say as a state, we're not going to tolerate racist, anti-Semitic conduct. Not, you can think whatever you want to think. This isn't the thought police. But when your conduct exhibits that kind of conduct, when your action speaks louder than words or thoughts, then we're going to enhance the criminal penalty. And Senator from Aiken, you were not particularly enamored with enhanced penalties when you and Senator Jackson discussed this a couple weeks ago. I don't believe enhanced penalties deter anybody from committing a crime. I, like Senator Hembry, have been dealing with criminals, either prosecuting them or representing them for a very long time, half a century. I have yet to run into a criminal that said, I was going to rob that store, but I didn't because I knew I could get a mandatory minimum 25 years. Or I'm not going to sell that kilo of cocaine because I knew I was going to get a mandatory minimum 25 years. Criminals aren't very smart people, mostly. That's why so many of them get caught. Now, white-collar criminals, the stockbroker, the investment advisor, the CEO of a company, they actually do and are deterred by not necessarily a mandatory minimum, but the sense that they might go to prison. Or I know this is an antiquated concept. It's something that was around when I first started prosecuting cases. The social approbation of being convicted, just being convicted, your reputation meant something. Not so much anymore. Martha Stewart goes to prison, gets out, and monetizes it. Really? I mean, she would have been, 50 years ago, she would have been toast. She would have been, no one would have been enamored of her, wanted to replicate her. So as we talk about critical race theory, we need to also talk about hate crimes. Let me share experience with you. And again, I never had any social association. I never was in the same car with a young African American when I was growing up, because we didn't live anywhere near each other. We didn't go to school together. Our high school football team was all white. When I got to Clemson, our football team was all white. So we didn't actually participate together in anything. But I do remember becoming aware of the fact that we always felt that or told that black folks wanted it this way because they were more comfortable where they were. You know, I'm 17 years old. I'm not questioning that. I have a very comfortable suburban life. But I think of two instances which sort of brought my focus on this. I went into a bar outside of Clemson in 1969 with a young man, an African-American student, and we stopped. It wasn't in Clemson. It was near Clemson. And Senator from Gaffney would tell you there's a difference between what's going on in the town of Clemson and what's going on 10 miles away. We sat down, ordered a beer. One beer came, put in front of me. The bartender says, "You can have a beer, but the N has to go," and points a pistol at him. And I thought to myself, I wanted to say something. I wanted to do something. This was so wrong. And my friend said, "Let's get out of here." Smart. The other instance that still today I remember and I'm ashamed of happened about 150 yards that way, 1971. I stopped at a restaurant on Main Street. It was open all night long. This was relatively early in the evening. I worked in the, whatever the white building is they're making into a hotel. It was my freshman year in law school. And as I was waiting to get a cup of coffee to go, a young African-American couple walked in with two kids, probably two young kids, an 8-year-old boy, maybe a 10-year-old boy. And the woman, elderly white woman who was working in there, she said, "What do you want?" And the man said, "We want a table." She said, "You need to get out of here. We don't serve ends here." And what amazed me about that, and I still remember the look on the faces of those two kids, the fact that their parents were being shamed in that way. 50 years later, I still remember it. And I remember I'm still ashamed that I didn't say anything, that I didn't do anything, that I didn't intercede and say, "Whoa now, they've got a right, got all the accommodations laws, we've got cases that allow them to eat wherever they want to eat. They are the same as us." I didn't. And by that point, I knew better. I had been involved in civil rights activities. I'd been to Martin Luther King's funeral. I've dealt with African-American activists. I knew what it was all about, but I didn't have the guts to intercede for that family. I'm ashamed of that. Today, I'm ashamed of that. And the question is what we're doing here today. Now, critical race theory, there's no evidence that's being taught anywhere, and I understand it's something that there is some fear of out there. And again, I don't know what facts we're going to follow. Cotton Ed Smith, here's a fact, historical fact. Cotton Ed Smith, United States Senator from South Carolina, Democrat, as they all were in 1940, went to the national convention where FDR was renominated. He, at the front end, they had an African-American preacher from Philadelphia get up and give the invocation. Cotton Ed was beside himself. He got up and left and told reporters, they said, "Why are you leaving?" He said, "Because I will not," and then he gave a list of the most racist, vile comments. I'm tempted to say them here, but as I've been reminded many times, this is not a place that we should use that kind of language. But he was the United States Senator who I think was, prior to being United States Senator, was in this chamber. The racial comments he used to describe a preacher giving an invocation made me sick to my stomach. Do we teach our kids that? That's history. That's a fact. Do we tell them that or should we allow them to know that what happened in this state based on race, we're embarrassed by. I'm embarrassed by it. Because if we do that, then perhaps those students will understand we've got to do better. Perhaps those students will understand why the minority population in this state who've been lynched by our former governor, Ben Tillman, who've been denied access to virtually every opportunity that we have. I'm talking about us white folks. Why they might feel that they should be, that racism that was spoken, that racism that was lived, that racism that we all believed in, I believed in it. I lived it. Shouldn't we do something to reject that, to say, not that we're sorry, that sorry's not going to do it, but we're going to make sure that anybody that still thinks that way will be exposed. I'm not trying to deter anybody, but the SOB we catch hurting somebody because they're Jewish, or killing somebody because they're black, or killing somebody because of any other of the criteria listed in the hate crimes bill will be punished more. I never believed for a second that any mandatory minimum or even the death penalty deterred anybody from committing a crime. But when we caught them and we prosecuted them, we let them hold it. That's what was important. That person's deterred. Pee Wee Gaskins is deterred by the death penalty. He's dead. He'd never he committed his last murder by killing somebody on death row after he'd had his previous death sentences commuted to life. He was looking at the chance of parole. He wasn't deterred. He liked killing. Most of the career criminals I've met like committing the crime. They like committing, whether it's breaking in cars, breaking in houses, raping, stealing. If they're career criminals, they're career criminals because they like doing it. Selling drugs. It's an easy way to make a lot of money. So what I'm saying to you is that as we debate CRT, and there's going to be, people are going to be talking about how it's going to be onerous on teachers and administrators. The one thing I do like about this bill is it's going to end this lawsuit like we have over in Lexington. Parents won't be suing over it. There's an administrative process which will consume people's time. And again, what are the facts when we start debating? I mean, if a parent thinks that the cause of the Civil War was not to preserve slavery, and another one thinks it was, what are we going to say? What is the fact? That's fact-driven education. And again, all of that is in the context of this hate crimes bill. And I understand, and I've talked to the majority leader and others, that they're not the votes in your caucus to have a vote on it. I want you to think about that. Why not let this body vote on it? Why not let us express either we think there needs to be an expression by this body that we're not going to tolerate crimes based on race, creed, or color, that we're going to stand up and say people that commit those crimes need to be punished more. I don't get it. And again, maybe your experience wasn't my experience. I participated in that racist conduct. Most of my life through ignorance, because it was what we all did. Some of my life because I didn't want to be different. I didn't want to speak out. I know you find that shocking today, but it took me a while to figure that one out. And so I understand, also there's this overlay of what's going to sell next year in a re-election. Will it benefit some folks by saying we passed a hate crimes bill? Will it benefit some folks by saying we stopped them? This should not be that kind of issue. This does not hurt anybody or help anybody. This is an issue that will allow folks to feel good about our statement that we're not going to tolerate this kind of conduct. And I promised myself I wouldn't speak extensively. There are other folks that are going to do that. Because I wanted to convince you. I'm not going to get up here and bombastically blather. I want to convince you of the sincerity of my position, and I want to convince you to look at your position. And is it based on, I mean, I've heard people say, well, we're not going to distinguish or base our criminal laws or distinguish on the basis of somebody's race, creed, or color. I understand that there's, may be some philosophical, constitutional, but at the same time, understand the impact of taking that philosophical. I mean, I've debated the senator from Charleston on interpretation of the Constitution on several different occasions, and he knows his stuff. I mean, I got to tell you, he knows his stuff. Even so, he's not right all the time. If your position on this bill, hate crimes bill, is that it's constitutionally infirm, I don't know that any court has said that, and I'm a big believer in precedents. If on the other hand you have a belief that it's just giving in, I would encourage you to understand that being kind, being generous, understanding pain from people that you don't understand how they get the pain, what they have to go home to, what they deal with on a daily basis. I've heard a number of quotations from the scriptures recently justifying this or that. I mean, what would Jesus do? What would Jesus do? He'd help people quell that pain.
Senator from Richland, Senator Jackson, what purpose do you rise?
Thank you, Mr. President. With Senator Yale.
I will.
Senator Yields. Senator Yields.
Senator, did you know, first of all, I really appreciate you and what you said. You and I have talked personally about this and what you shared with me, but did you know that I really appreciate that from you? So thank you. Also, did you know that on this very day, May 10th, 1740, the South Carolina General Assembly passed something called the Negro Act of 1740. This very day, May 10th, 1740. Let me tell you what it says. It authorized white enslavers to whip, kill, enslave Africans for being rebellious. It was a bill that was introduced in South Carolina General Assembly after what happened in 1739. Senator, have you heard of the Stono Rebellion? Yes. Stono Rebellion down in Charleston happened in 1739. After 1739, did you know that after what happened in 1739, that involved approximately 50 enslaved black people, that South Carolina passed this act? And so would you be concerned that if an educator in school was to take this and say, in fact, if you read the language in the act, they make no mistake about it. They say, we are promoting white supremacists, saying that the whites are inherently smarter, brighter, and more intelligent than the black slaves. Would you not be concerned that if a teacher or an educator read this history, that teacher or educator perhaps would be challenged or the job would be in jeopardy just for quoting facts?
Well, I would. And let me say this. What happened in 1740 is history.
Sure.
And those are facts. I'm sure that what you've quoted is accurate. But what I don't want to do, and I mean, I think the debate about what the facts are and the facts aren't, under this bill is important, but let it not blind us to the fact that you and others, and you can trace your heritage back to
1776.
1776. Wow. You probably could be a son or daughter of the American Revolution. Not me, but
So
you
we're
could.
sons and daughters of somebody famous somewhere.
That's right. But let me give you an example. Because of my recent flirtation with television fame, I was invited to attend the Armenian Bar Association last weekend in New York. The speaker was Justice Sotomayor. Not a big crowd, and she is somebody who I admire. Not having been raised in an Armenian community, I mean, my grandparents came to this country in the early 1900s because the Ottoman Empire was killing Armenians because of their Christian faith. 1.5 million of them were murdered. Recently, Joe Biden recognized that as a genocide. Hitler in Mein Kampf commended the Ottomans on what they did to the Armenians, except for the efficiency. They wasted a bullet on each one, and said, who remembers the Armenians? So that genocide was the model for Hitler's more expansive genocide 50 years later or 40 years later. But what I heard from, these are very accomplished attorneys from all over the country, many of them, most of them from New York, is this remembrance of what happened 100 years ago, as if it happened today. So culturally, they can't forget and don't want to forget what happened. So when you tell me about history, you can't forget it. It didn't happen to my ancestors. It happened to yours. What happened to my ancestors is they had to flee the country as the Turks, the Muslims, were massacring the Christians. And they came to this country. My father was born here. I was born here. So I'm 2 generations removed from that. But I haven't relished or, involved myself in the Armenian community because I brought up in Charlotte, North Carolina. And as far as I know, my family was the Armenian community. My mother was not Armenian, so I'm only half. Her maiden name was Williams. I've talked to the senator from Lawrence about my ancestor, who he has figured out from Ohio was a member of the Union Army that may have been part of Sherman's entourage that came here in 1865. We're not sure of that. But their memory of what happened is not going anywhere. His memory of what happened is not going anywhere. Are these facts? Yes. Is what happened to the Armenians? Well, the Turks still say it wasn't a genocide. The Armenians fled into the desert and died, 1.5 million of them, of taking the wrong turn on the road. I think that's true. The evidence is otherwise. So I guess what I'm saying to you is, this is 2 things. One, should a teacher be able to teach that? Absolutely. Should a teacher be able to teach what Cotton Ed Smith said and what his position was? Or should they be able to teach that Strom Thurmond left the Democratic Party in 1948 because Harry Truman integrated the armed services? Now, I love Senator Thurmond. I prosecuted the woman that killed his daughter. I spent a year with him on and off every week. Strom Jr. is someone I admire. I love the entire family. But Strom Thurmond in 1948 was clearly a racist. Now, he made up for it, but he quit the party when Harry Truman integrated the armed services.
Senator,
So those are facts.
just one last question to Senator Yale. So would you agree then that it would be wrong for any teacher to take what happened in 1740 and blame any child today for that?
Absolutely.
And would you agree that if an educator in any school today went to a classroom, took this and said, this is what happened in 1740, And because you are the same race as the people who did this, you are evil and this is your fault.
Absolutely wrong.
And would you agree that there are measures even today where that educator can be disciplined for those kind of actions?
Absolutely. I will say this, however. This bill would prohibit that teacher and the school from being sued.
Right.
And that, I must say, is a good thing.
It is a good, thank you, Senator.
Senator from Beaufort, what purpose do you rise, sir?
I wonder if the senator would yield for some questions.
Senator yield for questions?
Yes, I will.
Senator yields for questions.
Senator, I want you jogged my interest when you were talking about the discussions you've had offline with the senator from Charleston about the constitutionality of hate crimes legislation. And did you know that I recently held a forum on hate crimes on Hilton Head? And about 150 people were in attendance. And in preparation for that, did you know I researched the issue? And are you familiar with Chief Justice Rehnquist, or the former Chief Justice Rehnquist?
I actually argued a case in front of Chief Justice Rehnquist. I lost, but I argued a case in front of Chief Justice Rehnquist.
Isn't it true that he was appointed by President Nixon?
Yes.
Right? And isn't he known as a strict constructionist?
Yes.
Isn't he known as a conservative jurist?
Very conservative.
Did you know, Senator, that he issued and he authored the lead opinion in a Supreme Court case, Wisconsin versus Mitchell in 1993, which expressly upheld a Wisconsin statute that included enhancements for penalties for racially motivated crimes? Are you aware of that?
I wasn't aware of the name of the case. I was aware that he issued a decision.
I'm going to go ahead and read you some of that decision because I think it's dispositive of this issue of whether or not hate crimes is constitutional or not. We can have a debate about whether or not it's good public policy, and that's fine. But I think we ought to put to rest this idea that somehow it's somehow unconstitutional. Chief Justice Rehnquist, in the majority opinion, wrote, "Traditionally, sentencing judges have considered a wide variety of factors in addition to evidence bearing on guilt in determining what sentence to impose on a convicted defendant. The defendant's motive for committing the offense is one important factor. Motives are relevant when the trial judge sets the defendant's sentence, and it is not uncommon for a defendant to receive a minimum sentence because he was acting with good motives, or a rather high sentence because of his bad motives." And this is the part I really want to draw your attention to, Senator. "Deeply ingrained in our legal tradition is the idea that the more purposeful is the criminal conduct, the more serious is the offense, and therefore the more seriously and severely it ought to be punished. Moreover," and it goes on from that regard. So did you know that particular Supreme Court case upheld the constitutionality of hate crimes law, gave the legal underpinnings and the societal context in which those things are enacted, and then went on to describe what I was talking about with Senator Jackson when he had point of personal interest earlier, and see if you would agree with me on that. That a state, through its criminal code, speaks to what it considers to be heinous and speaks to what its values are. Is that correct? That a state, through what it decides to declare to be criminal and deciding what sentences to impose for criminal acts, does it not say something about the state by and through those enactments?
Well, it says who we are.
That's correct. And what does it say about South Carolina, that we're one of two states in the nation that doesn't consider whether or not somebody was motivated by racial hatred or hatred of gays or hatred of religion? What does it say about us that we don't have that as an aggravating circumstance when we already have other aggravating circumstances in the code? What does it say about us as a state to not include those things?
Well, you know, Senator, it's easy for me to say, it would be easy for me to say, it says that we are heartless, unconcerned, racially insensitive people. I don't believe that about this body. I don't believe it. I just think that we need leadership, people to stand up, as I didn't stand up for those two 9 and 10-year-olds, to have the courage I didn't have to express that we are people concerned about racial animus.
And I agree with you. And as the people's representatives up here, and as those that are speaking on our constituents' behalf up here, would we not benefit from a debate about what the therapeutic or salutary effect of including those sorts of enhancements in our code would have in our society? Would they not benefit from that discussion?
It would. But again, I think, unfortunately, these issues become bumper sticker issues. And so what I'd say to folks on both sides, on both hate crimes and CRT, is let's not make this a re-election issue. Let's not make this a bumper sticker. Let's do what we think in our heart of hearts is right. There's some parts of the CRT bill I agree with. I'm troubled by who determines what the facts are.
Sir, I appreciate you answering my questions, and it is a context in which we can discuss hate crimes, and that's why I wanted this opportunity, because I do think it's important that the people of South Carolina hear us discussing that issue. So I thank you for yielding.
Thank you.
Senator from Lexington, Senator Setzler, what purpose do you rise? Senator Yield.
I will.
Senator yields for question.
Senator, are you aware that I was here in 1999, as were some other people, when we passed a hate crime bill in the South Carolina Senate?
I was not. What happened to it? What happened to it? House didn't. Shocking. I'm going to finish here because I said I'd speak 20 minutes, although in the context of this body, 20 minutes. I just want to leave you with this. Again, if you would look, and I'm going to look very carefully at hate crimes, and I'm going to look very carefully at CRT. Figure out, I mean, if you got parents that are concerned about being taught, and Senator from Spartanburg talked about Teacher of the Year and what her personal opinions were, or I don't know whether it was a he or she. But they're not, those opinions aren't being expressed in the classroom. I'm just worried that we're going to restrict access to knowledge of young people based on who decides what the facts are. On the hate crimes legislation, I mean, look into your hearts and say, does this in some way, I don't think anybody wants to apologize for anything that we didn't do. When I say we, us, I'm certainly not going to apologize for my great-grandfather, my grandfather, or even my father's conduct. But we have a chance to say to those folks who've not had power, whose ancestors did suffer and suffer mightily, and are still suffering, because there is still racism in our society. It's not, in many instances, the overt racism I grew up with, but it's still there. This is some salve to their concerns, and it doesn't cost you anything. So look into your heart and have the courage to do what I didn't have the courage to do 50 years ago. Thank you.